Good afternoon, everyone. Yay, yes, please, give yourselves a round of applause, please. Thank you very much for sharing your day with us here at our Black Media Symposium at Boston University. My name is Tina McDuffie. I'm an associate professor of the practice of journalism here at Boston University, more specifically broadcast journalism. And I'm also the host of the Local USA series, which airs on GBH World Channel, which is based here in Boston. And it is my pleasure to have some conversation today about how to be an effective workplace ally. And so in order to do that, I have some wonderful experts who are with us this afternoon. And because I know that we have had some technical problems, forgive me, but I printed everything out because I always make sure I have pen and paper. Shauna Nuckles is here. Please raise your hand, Shauna, so that everyone knows who you are. Shauna is an award-winning entrepreneur and the founder of Advocation and Operations and Training Consultancy for PR, digital, and creative firms on a mission to de-stress agency teams. She has mentored more than 3,000 professionals on how to make fast-paced workplaces healthier and happier at every level. And we were just talking about being happy and healthy in the workplace with Dr. Senya Bembe, so that's fantastic. Welcome, Shauna. Next is Doris Truong. She is the Senior Director of Teaching and Diversity Strategies at Poynter Institute. Please raise your hand, Doris, so they know who you are. Excellent. Poynter Institute is a journalism education nonprofit that is based in St. Petersburg, Florida. We call it St. Pete. She's currently a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan, where she is researching unconscious bias and how to help journalists better cover all communities. So this will be a great conversation. Moiz Syed is a designer, hello, and data journalist based in Portland, Maine. He works for Mozilla as a product design lead for Pocket. Previously, he worked at ProPublica, The Intercept, and Wikimedia Foundation. So welcome to all of you. Please give them a round of applause. All right, so let's start with this definition and then we can get into conversation. Okay, being an ally, when we put you in the workplace, means continually working to champion an environment of inclusivity and mutual respect in the workplace. Now, is there anything else that any of you would add to that description of a workplace ally?
I think it's important to acknowledge that allyship needs to be defined by people who are involved in it. So there should be some sort of common agreement in your workplace as to what allyship looks like there, because my definition of allyship is probably not exactly going to be what my colleague's definition is. But if we agree to some ground rules of what that looks like and how I can advocate for somebody without speaking on top of them or speaking for them without their permission, that's a really key part of it. So just really setting those expectations and ground rules for how to interact in your workplace are really key.
Anybody else? Shauna, Moiz?
So is this on? Can you guys hear me?
There you go.
Is that
Yes.
good? Okay. When I think about the phrase ally and allyship, I always think about the gap and standing in the gap, and in particular, the gap of where we've been and where we want to go. And where we've been is systems, institutions that are held up by white supremacy, and where we want to go is not that. So when I think about allyship, it's standing in that place, and I think they used a phrase earlier called being an accomplice, and I use that phrase, or a co-conspirator, and I think that is an important piece of being an ally as well.
Yeah, and just adding to what both Doris and Shauna just said, I mean, I think when I think of allyship, I actually want to think of it as something that is sort of more grounded in our own human experiences, something that is simple, not something that is these big lofty ideal. And I think one of the things that we have to just remember is figuring out and struggling for and fighting for ways that we could propagate systems and propagate means to get everybody be treated like you would like to be treated yourself. That's it. you know? And that's a very simple idea. You know, I teach this to my like little like 1-year-old, 2-year-old kids, you know? And yeah, and it's not something like that has to be very complicated.
So speaking of not being complicated, you actually made a how-to, you and your wife.
No, just me.
Just you. Okay. She doesn't get any credit for that. I'm sorry.
She's amazing too, though. Yeah, yeah.
And so how did you, first of all, how did you recognize that you needed to do a how-to? And then how did you do it? How did you do the how-to?
So this work stemmed from, you know, at this time, you know, I was working at The Intercept. You know, I was, you know, part of many, you know, journalists of color groups. You know, there's a really good journalists of color Slack that I would recommend everybody here joining to. And I think, you know, this work stemmed out of sort of like, you know, my conversation.
Interject, I think it's only for journalists of color.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is only for journalists of color. Thank you. You know, thank you, Doris. And and yeah, so this sort of like work came out of you know, I ran a little survey from that community, right? And you know, asking them very simple questions about allyship and about their experiences of how they have found you know, a lack you know, of allyship in newsrooms. And from there, sort of like, you know, distill those findings from that survey, and it's up online right now. You know, you could go to, it's at tinyurl.com/how-to-be-a-white-ally. And yeah, and from there, like, you know, built a guide, you know, that basically like, you know, actually covers like 4 like you know, very detailed steps, right? The first step is just to like work on yourself, like work on your own self, right? That you know, includes things like learning about you know, our country's racist history, right? Learning about ideas like intersectionality, learning about, you know, ideas like you know, bias, whiteness, you know, things of that nature. And then it goes on from there to like more sort of like, you know, loftier goals, like you know, how do you do direct action in the service of allyship, right? And yeah, so there's a guide up there. I totally recommend you all checking out.
So you mentioned racism, institutional racism. Is it possible to be a workplace ally if you reject the idea of an institutional racism or this country's history rooted in, you know, racism? And that's for anybody on the panel, but I'm looking at Doris. So the question is, if I would say, hey, you know what, this isn't a racist country at all, am I someone who can be an ally to a person of color in a newsroom, in a, you know, filmmaking suite, et cetera?
I think it would be important for somebody who wants to be an ally to recognize whatever kind of privilege you might have. Some of that might not be race-based. Some of that might be based on your socioeconomic status, your education, your knowledge of the area. So if you are from Boston and you're working at a local TV station, you're likely to have a lot more inside knowledge about the geography and the past of the city than somebody who just moved here. So you're gonna have to evaluate what kinds of privilege you have, what's your standing in the organization, what kind of influence you can bring to bear on something. And really doing something that is helpful to someone else without looking to be recognized for your work in that, for like, that's performative allyship. You want to do something that is helpful to somebody else just because it is helpful to somebody else. So I don't think it necessarily has to be steeped in whether you are acknowledging that racism continues to be a problem, but what is your own varying levels of privilege and how can you leverage those to help somebody who doesn't necessarily have those?
Thank you. Shauna, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm trying to run through all the scenarios in my head where you could be an ally and reject the history of the country that we live in, and I just don't think that there is. I think that to Moiz's point, that's probably the first step, is recognition, awareness, and education that, hey, this is the reality that we live in. Because I'm sure everyone in this room has had a moment in time where you realize there are people around us who are living in a completely different reality. And until you step into that shared experience and do everything you can to understand it, no, I don't think that you it would be performative allyship, to Doris's point, I think.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, if you reject the fact that we live in a racist society and we have an enormously racist history, then be an ally to yourself and read some history books,
I'm asking that because that's actually a conversation I had with one of my colleagues 10 years ago. He said, this isn't a racist country at all. There's no racism, but I'm definitely an ally. I was like, oh, okay. What can I say? What can you say to that? So I figured I would bring that up so that we can have a conversation, because we're all, learning in here today. And let's start with the basics of where do you come from? What do you believe? What's your belief system? And then maybe we can go from there.
I would just say I'm usually slightly suspicious anytime someone starts the conversation with, I'm an ally. Because if you're truly an ally, you're demonstrating through your action your allyship. You don't have to come out and tell me that you're an ally. I will know it because I have experienced it.
And speaking of that, does anyone have a personal experience where you can walk that out and say, this is where someone, was an ally for me in X situation, and this was the outcome? We have to think. Yeah, I know, it's hard to, kind of be on the spot about that. But all right, this is an interesting question, and this actually came from a student. And I know that we have some students here today, and we're going to encourage you to ask questions, not just students, but everyone who's here. But I would love to hear from some of my students who I see in the audience. But here is the question that I was asked yesterday by a comm journalism student. How, from your experiences, do you think allies can best help contribute producing media unrelated to their own race, gender, sexuality without confining the people leading the charge? That's a question from a journalism student, emailed that to me last night.
So, do we think this person is asking how I, as an Asian American, might cover an issue that is mostly affecting the Black community? Is that what they're asking?
Let's start with that, yep.
Okay, so, if that were something that I wanted to do, if that were an assignment that I had been given, or if that were a passion of mine that I wanted to investigate, I would be looking to talk to people who understand that community, because I would go into it knowing that there's a lot of things I don't know. You want to try to find out what are the questions that you need to be thinking about before you even get there. What are some of the ways that you can be really humble because it's not your community? Is there anybody who might be a fixer in that community who could maybe go with you? Like, this happens a lot on non-US, non-English speaking countries. Like, you might have a fixer on the territory who is someone who lives on the ground, who knows the community better than you do. And we can do that in the United States or in whatever your country is. But you can do that with communities that you're not super familiar with also. Bringing somebody in who can kind of vouch for you and say, Doris is here because she wants to cover us in an accurate, humane way. And I think that's a really key part of journalism too, is that people often think, oh, they're coming to cover me. Either it's gonna be great or it's gonna be really bad. And you have to make sure that you're gonna cover the story accurately, which they might not necessarily agree was like super glowing or maybe didn't bring all the ills to light, but you did do it accurately.
There's a phrase that comes to mind for me. I don't know how big, if this is an age gap, but does anyone know Brene Brown? She's a researcher, yes. So she uses a phrase called, there's a difference between being right and getting it right. And I think, to Doris's point, ensuring that you go in with that mentality that you aren't going to have all of the answers, but you're going to bring a unique point of view as well. And I think making sure that you stay curious and are open to being wrong is the right mindset to have when you go into a situation like that.
Okay. I wanted to go back to this idea of workplace ally, because I think someone on this panel used the word cutthroat at some point today. Newsrooms can be cutthroat, studios can be cutthroat, PR firms can be cutthroat. Why would I, having privilege, Doris, as we talked about, put myself in a position where I can potentially jeopardize that privilege by becoming an ally to someone? Why would I do that?
I mean, for those of you who were with us earlier in the day when the previous panel talked about needing accomplices, which is a little bit more, like the accomplices are going to do more for you than allies. I think you do want that. You want to know that somebody isn't just going to be there with you in word, but they want to be with you in deed. That this speaks to the importance of having not just mentors, but sponsors, people who will help you get ahead, even if sometimes it's at their own detriment. And so you want to think about that before you necessarily step into the role of being an ally.
Yeah, I think it sort of like, goes back to the idea of like, we're never going to be free unless all of us are free. And so why do you jeopardize, like, as somebody who has power, who has privilege, why do you jeopardize that by, putting yourself on the line for like another person of color or something like that? Or if you're white, doing that for another person of color? I think it comes down to the fact that, can you do you want to sort of like live in a world where someone doesn't do that for you, right? And if you want to sort of live in a society where that happens and where that continues to happen, you have to be part of that. Yeah.
That's exactly the same. I can speak for me, and that's exactly the reason for me is what kind of world do we want to live in? And our careers are long. There's ample opportunity if you lose a little bit of leverage to gain that leverage back, whether you may have to go to a new company, but that's the way of the world. So that is the exact same reason for me, is it's the way I want to navigate in the world. And I think having a worthy cause and a reason that gets you excited to participate in the society and in the workplace is also another reason to do that, is just having a worthy reason to show up for work besides just doing the work.
And we talk about small steps, right? As the previous panelist Travell was saying, I can pull someone aside after a meeting. It doesn't have to necessarily be a big email where everyone is CC'd, et cetera. So let's talk about some of those small steps, because we start small, right? Everywhere we start small. So let's talk about some small steps for allyship.
I have many of them. I think, things as small as like, I think it starts from like, for white people in the audience, like, do you have a close black friend? Do you have, because I feel like, I live, in big cities. I've always lived in big cities in the US, and, I meet people all the time that have zero friends of color. And, and it kind of like just like shocks me every time, when I just like, when I realize that. Small things like learn how to like pronounce our names, right? Just like simple things, like, learn how to sort of, acknowledge that there is this like, power imbalance, and also that, where you come from, where people come from is very important, and those experiences are very important, and those things are just part of humanity. They're just part of human experiences, right? And these are small things, everyday things. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I was thinking about how it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that if one person gets ahead, then the other person's not necessarily going to get ahead. And this is also pointed to something that Moiz talked about when we had our prep call, but salary transparency. So when you're making salaries transparent, you're not just helping people of color, you're not just helping people at that level of job, you're helping anybody who's curious, what does this industry make for that kind of role, with that kind of experience, for this kind of gender? And you're helping people be able to set a baseline to empower themselves to get the money that they're worth when they go to negotiate for their own jobs.
Another thing that I just thought of was, I think one of the most powerful sort of like tools that everybody has in their arsenal, right, is apology, apologizing when you were wrong, or when you think that you have made a mistake. I think a lot of people sort of like don't put themselves in the position of being an ally because they're afraid that they will make a misstep, that they will say something that will be silly, or that will be misconstrued as like something that it wasn't. Right? And I think if you feel that way, that you've made a mistake, just apologize. Just sincerely apologize, because that will be a learning moment for you, right? And I think so many people like, make a big hullabaloo of that too now, with like, oh, I don't want to be canceled, right? And I think all of those things sort of like, end up being barriers for people to see themselves as ally, as working as an ally.
Building on that a little bit, I think one of the smallest, most important steps you can take is keep trying, because you will get it wrong. You will have to apologize. You will learn and become more nuanced and sophisticated, for lack of a better understanding, in the way you move through the workplace. But if you let embarrassment or a fear of not being perfect stop you from taking those small actions, I think that ends up deterring people throughout their career to keep speaking up.
We have many students in our audience who are starting their first internships, their first jobs. How do they know who an ally is? Should we find them, or should they find the ally?
I mean, it depends on the workplace you're going to. I can speak most knowledgeably about journalism, but at larger organizations, you might have an employee resource group. So that, I think, is a natural place to potentially find allies. You'll at least find people who have an affinity. So potentially, if you're LGBTQ, there would be an LGBTQ group. If not, you may want to look into joining an association. So we talked about the National Association of Black Journalists earlier. There are other groups, the Asian American Journalists Association, which I have been a member of since college, and is really my extended family. And it's because we share so many intersectionalities. We share culture, we share our passion for journalism. We understand what is the struggle of like our parents didn't want us to go into journalism, that kind of thing. But I can also go to them with things that I wouldn't necessarily go to somebody that's a friend of mine from the Hispanic Journalists Association with, because there's that commonality.
Yeah, I mean, I think in sort of like newsrooms, I mean, I've worked at like, medium-sized newsrooms like The Intercept and then ProPublica. And I think in both of those spaces, even though they were not, ginormous newsrooms like the Times or something, they still had, Slack channels or, Signal group chats, right, amongst, workplace colleagues. That were focused, on specific sort of like, group, right? And I think as a person starting sort of like a job, like, the first, in the first few weeks, I feel like it's like pretty overwhelming to like figure out how do I navigate the space, right? But I think as you start sort of like, spending some time with your colleagues that you're working with, I think these sort of things, these sort of channels and pathways like become like more clear, right? That you should totally be part of. And if you find that there aren't any, that you're in a newsroom or you're in a workplace where there aren't any sort of like channels or groups or spaces like that, make one, start one. It doesn't have to be a big thing again, right? It could just be a very simple like, maybe a Slack conversation, with just you and a few more people, or maybe just like a Signal group chat or a WhatsApp group chat that you could just include people just talking about work, just talking about things that you're seeing at work, right? And that can grow from there.
Oh, and just acknowledging the setting that we're in, tap your alumni network. There's probably people who have gone to an internship there before, who might still be interns there or now bosses there, who could help you navigate that and really help you shortcut that path.
So when we think about an ally, give me maybe 3 adjectives. I think of someone who's curious, who's courageous, and who is kind. That's what I think of when I think of an ally. You're thinking hard, Moiz.
No, I'm thinking hard because I think, I'm trying to figure out like what 3 adjectives I would say that would come up like at the top of that list, because I do think like allies come in like all shapes and forms, right? And it's as complicated as humanity. Like we all are all different, right? I personally would say that an ally, should be approachable, should be friendly, right? Should be somebody who is good at listening, right? Like a good journalist, really, and Because I think those things, those qualities, you know, come in very handy, because if you don't do them, you know, then you cannot be a sort of a person that somebody else can like lean on to, right?
That was beautiful. Very well said.
I don't know if I have 3 specific adjectives, but the one word that comes to mind for me is awake, like someone who has their eyes and ears open and is paying attention and who cares. And so that to me, when I think of an ally, is somebody who is awake and paying attention and actually cares to make a difference.
Yeah, I'll just add two to the list. I would say someone who's genuine, so somebody who's motivated by something that is not through artifice, and then somebody who's really empathetic, which is something that you can become better at. You just have to keep practicing at it, and it sounds trite, but I know from practicing that it's possible to become more empathetic if you really practice at it.
Excellent. We're going to hopefully open it up for questions at this point. Do we have any questions from the audience? I hope we do. Yes. Please give a round of applause for my student, my journalism student, Akua.
Do you want me to stand up? Or,
Absolutely.
Okay. My question is there any moment in your journalism careers that you guys performed allyship, and then how did that make you feel?
Oh my God, I think, I hope that there are many moments, right? Like, I think one of the bigger, most prominent things that I was part of that I'm very proud of is helping my colleagues unionize at The Intercept, right? Because I think the act of unionizing, the act of like coming together as a union and forming a union and to fighting for a collective voice is an incredibly powerful tool in sort of like making ally network within that newsroom, right? Because suddenly what you've done is that once you are a union and once you have once you have been recognized and you have this like power of like bargaining against your employer, you have also built this like community where like people can share stories, share their experiences, and figure out how to actually build systems, figure out ways to like help them by actually convincing the management to respond to those experiences, right? So I think that part of it is like, I feel like one of the like most prominent thing that I did as an ally. I feel like that is a really like important thing in my life that I've done. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to answer?
So my background is in agency life and not necessarily journalism, but there have been a few throughout my career that really stand out. But I think going back to the point that we said earlier, it's like those micro moments that really add up over time. As we talked about, the amount of privilege that you have throughout your career changes. So early on in my career, there was a moment that stands out where I advocated for a person of color getting hired to be the talent in a commercial. I have fired people for making racist remarks continuously in the workplace. And now I get to sit at board tables with CEOs and have conversations about why their leadership team doesn't have any person of color or sometimes even women on them. And this is probably not a very PC thing to say. I wish I could say like, oh, I'm so proud of all of those moments, but in all honesty, like it really pisses me off when I'm in those moments that we still, that it's needed, really, in all honesty. So that's just the honest truth of how I feel in the moments, like those big moments.
Thank you for your honesty. We need honesty.
Oh, I would just say that when I look back on the things that I have done that are, I think perhaps most impactful is when I advocated for Indigenous journalists and also for LGBTQ journalists in various boards where I was a member, and there were various things happening where we were really having to think about what does inclusion mean on these boards that were already quite diverse. And those moments stand out because I think people expect me to advocate for Asian Americans, and of course I do, But I think it's much more meaningful when somebody who's outside of your community takes the time to learn about what matters to you and then speaks up with your consent on their behalf.
Any other questions? Our Dean, Mariette DiCristina.
Uh-oh.
Thank you, Professor McDuffie. Thank you all for the fascinating conversation. One thing I was thinking of, seeing as we are in a learning environment, love the tip about to be an ally to yourself and get some reading done. Any suggestions for some of your favorites that have really challenged your perceptions over time?
I'm so bad at like remembering things. I mean, you know, and I have to give a shout out to like an Abraham X Kendi, obviously, like because of where I am right now. Yeah.
I'm also drawing a blank, sorry. It'll come back to me.
Wait, Mariette, repeat that again.
So I was thinking, you know, that this idea of reading or absorbing or listening or learning in some way, if you would like to be a better ally, some ways to become attentive, become more awake, more aware. You know, when I got to be myself, I read a stack of books, but other people might like to watch videos or a movie or something that inspires them and gave them some resonant learning. So I was hoping for any suggestions, especially with the students and others in mind here.
Got it. So I'm actually real bad at reading right now, which is not great to acknowledge as somebody who's a fellow at the University of Michigan. But I love audiobooks or anything that I can listen to on audio. And so Heather McGee wrote The Sum of Us, but there's also a podcast that I think is only on Spotify. But the podcast version is great because you can listen to it on varying speeds. And you can get all these different insights into different parts of America and different things that you might not have thought about in terms of equity and how, again, it's not a zero-sum game.
I'm gonna say 2 books, and I think they like both of them significantly changed like my life. And now that I've gotten like a few seconds to like think through it, you know, yeah, it like really like had an impact on me. Number one is you know, and this sounds like, you know, a very cliche answer, and I think of like, you know, because you see this like book as such a like a high pinnacle of work, but I think like you know, Malcolm X's autobiography is an important book, right? And I think if you haven't read it, if you're white, you haven't read it, please read it. It's an extremely good read, right? And it's an extremely compelling read, you know. And of course, like, you know, since you know, I mean, it's been like decades since that was published. There's been many things that have come out about like, you know, the process of how that book was written and how that was flawed. But I think there is this like emotional truth there that is still resonant, right? The second book that I would say is a book called Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, which is also, you know, an extremely popular book. Of course, Bryan Stevenson, I mean, he's had a movie made about him, which is incredible too.
Starring Jamie Foxx and Michael B. Jordan,
exactly,
if anybody's interested.
Yeah, exactly. When you're so good that Michael B. Jordan plays you are really good. And but that book is extremely powerful, and his work is extremely powerful. And I think like the way that he went about it, at every step of the way, you could feel this sense of like allyship in that work. Yeah. So those are my 2 picks.
I also am drawing a blank on specific titles, but one thing I will say is, in my opinion, how important it is for there to be a diversity of opinions and viewpoints in the media you consume every day. So I think even as simple as following people on social media who maybe come from a different community than you and have a different viewpoint, a different experience, like those micro moments that they share about their lives, and in my experience is just so powerful in interacting with people in a different way, and can be equally as great as a book or an audiobook too.
Agreed. Throughout my journalism career, it's nothing for me to show up at a temple. It's nothing for me to show up at a mosque. I will just show up in your community. If there's something going on, I want to know more about you, I'm going to come see you. And I'm going to sit down with you before there's breaking news in your community, so that you understand that I can actually talk to Tina McDuffie because I've seen her before. She's someone familiar to me. She's not just showing up because someone has, met their, an untimely demise or what have you. So, always think about that. And I preach this to my students all the time. Get comfortable walking into a room full of all kinds of different people. We have to do that as journalists. It's really important. So if you've never, seen, diverse groups of people, go to the West Indian Parade in Boston. Like, I'll go with you. I love seeing that, and I always encourage that. And I think that's really important because it's a sad day, I think, when you go into a newsroom and you're covering people that you don't know anything about. You've never seen them, you've never heard about them, only what you've seen on, on a soap opera or, some kind of a, stereotypical narrative. That's a sad day. And it's also a sad day when you have to supervise different people of color who you've never seen before, and now you're in a newsroom and they're trying to explain something to you about story ideas and you're just drawing a blank. So, the more exposure to different kinds of, facets of the world, the better. Any other questions? Yes. Hi.
Hello. Thank you for the excellent conversation. But I just want to express my own understanding of the word racism. I feel like racism changed its meaning than like 100 years ago. It's not just like gestures were unfair treatment to Black people, but more like people just tend to make friends with people who look similar to themselves. So like in this country, this is a very diverse country, but for the inclusion, I still think there should be some improvements. So do you guys think there might be like one day this country will be not only diverse, but also inclusive? Like everybody just can make friends with each other regardless of their color, their similarities.
God, I hope so. But you're right. I mean, the meaning of racism expands, right, over time, right? Our understanding of it expands over time, right? Because we are now, because of the folks, who have come before us and who have fought for this before us, like they have made the meaning of racism more deeper, more complicated. It includes many different facets, right? As far as sort of inclusivity is concerned, I think you're right, right? We are a diverse country. Obviously, we are a diverse country, right? But especially at the top of the totem pole, at the top of the sort of these power structures, right? We don't see that many people of color, right? And I think this is one thing. This is sort of this is whenever I say this, it's it kind of gets taken as a hot take. But I think even in our newsrooms or in our workplaces, in our colleges, schools, right? People who have power right now should really deeply think about sort of how can they distribute that power further, right? How can they share that power further? And I think and this is a small suggestion, right? One thing that we could do is that maybe we should put in place, right? And this should happen. I think this should happen in every newsroom, right, out there. Is that I think there should be term limits for people who are at the top of the newsrooms, right? If you're an editor-in-chief of the New York Times, you should not, and I think they do already have a term limit there, but I think it's far too long. But I think in other newsrooms they don't even have term limits, right? And I think term limits work, right? I mean, we have them for presidents, right? And it gives a chance for a new generation to come along, for new types of people to come along, to share that power and to structure those organizations, right? And I think far too much, we see that there's the same people, the same types of people at the top of the, coming from the same schools, the same networks, right, who are at the top of those places, and they don't, and those places never get to seem to get that diverse.
Can I address the inclusion piece that you, no, what is your name? Say again? Polly, okay. And you're a student here? Thank you for coming and thank you for speaking up, because I know it's not easy. It is not easy. So please, let's give her a round of applause before I... Because, you know, I'm encouraging all of our students to speak up. And so, you know, when they do speak up, I want to make sure that you guys know that we really appreciate it. We do this all the time, and it's not easy speaking in front of crowds. That second part that you talked about with inclusion, you know, when we talked about, you know, kind of only being around people who look similar to us, inclusion has to be deliberate. So going to places to talk to, you know, your classmates who are different from you, that's one small step that you can take in order to, you know, bring some inclusivity in your own, you know, at least into your own world. And start with that, and then, you know, you can expand from there. But, you know, those are, when we talk about these small, simple steps around allyship, that's something small and simple that you can actually do, that you can take that action and say, you know what? This student is someone that I'm not familiar with. Maybe we speak a different language. I'm going to have a conversation with them. I'm going to get to know them a little bit better and learn a little bit. And I think that that is something that's really, really important. So these efforts have to be deliberate. It's not a random thing that just happens. You have to set an intention to make it happen.
Yeah, and you're in an incredible city that is also very diverse. And I think, like, you get exposed to so much, you know, your life becomes so much richer when your circle of friends are diverse, right? Like, you know, the culture that you are exposed to, you know, even smaller things like sort of like, you know, the stories, the culture, the food, the music, you know, there's such a rich tapestry of you know, like diverse experiences out there that you are not getting exposed to if you're only hanging out with like a certain type of person or like one type of person, right? And I think it does take work, right? But it is deliberate work, and I think everybody can do it.
Any other questions? Hi. Oh, wow, we have 2 questions.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, my name is Okechi. I'm a postdoc in biology department. So the subject being conversed here is something so close to my heart. And these words, when they're being talked of equity, inclusion, and diversity, I mean, it's something which really leaves me with a lot of questions. I mean, to start with, like, we are talking of these issues here. My question is, do we just talk of them within the confines of this wall? Or are we having in mind that once we walk out of this place to the communities where we are, what impacts are they going to have? What impacts are they going to have? It's a question I've always asked, and I really never get an answer. I mean, there's the talk, and there is the walking the talk. So who is to do the walking of what we talk? I'm an international student. But the thing is, we know what is going on in this country. So you really wonder whether we are in 2023 or we are in the 60s. Look what is happening in Florida, what's happening in Texas. I mean, when we talk of an ally, my simple way of understanding it is that I should be able to stand up for somebody who, in one way or the other, is underprivileged in society, who is lacking something. The underprivileged could be access to education. It can be access to food, to shelter, and all this. But now, if we are going to talk, we are going to be allies, we are going to stand up for somebody. Is it within this room here?
It's out of the room, I hope.
I mean, how do you stand up for somebody outside this room when that is going to be influenced by the policies being formulated at the state level, the policies being formulated at the community level, and at some point, depending who is in power, they are going to be formulated at the federal level. When we talk of education, everybody is aware of admission should not be based on affirmative action. There is nobody of color, there is nobody black, there is nobody whatever. All of us are equal. So Harvard, Boston, Massachusetts, to whatever, no admission on affirmative action. You go down Florida to Texas, there should be no teaching about history, black history. There is no teaching about LGBTQ. There is no teaching about all this. And yet, these are the very, very groups which are being impacted on. And that's why we talk of allyship. So I would like to hear from the ladies and gentlemen in front there. I mean, is this the talk for the sake of the talk, or there is walking the talk? And who is going to do the walking? And how do you do that walking when you have these policies at the end of the day which become laws and regulations? Like in Florida now, an institution like Boston, you are being told if you are going to teach black community, blah, blah, if you are going to teach about LGBTQ on this, you will not get steady funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there's definitely challenges, there are definitely challenges. And I think that, this panel here, we're hopefully trying to encourage folks to make the small steps towards allyship so it does not become overwhelming, because what you just said to me completely overwhelmed me. I already knew it and it still overwhelmed me. So when I think about, this process that we're on, this journey that we're all on, we're talking about the small steps that hopefully will accumulate to the bigger steps as we move forward. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, and I think, like, you're right. It does sort of like stem out of these policies, right, that are being made in the most powerful chambers of this country, right? And those things, and those, life right now is extremely overwhelming. Reading news every day is extremely overwhelming right now. And but I do think, and I think, I can say this, and I think everybody on this panel, shares this feeling too, is that I think at the core of allyship is community building, and I think community building is incredibly important as a first step to fight those policies, to build a front to fight those policies, right? Because that is our ultimate goal. The ultimate goal isn't to sort of like help a colleague, fight for their promotion, right? Sure, yeah. If you're helping them do that, that's good too, right? But the ultimate goal is freedom for everybody, right? It's like his this like greater goal, which is a long struggle, and this is just a small step. And by no means we mean that this work should only be within the confines of our extremely privileged jobs or extremely privileged educational settings, et cetera, right? It should always be seeing outwardly.
Our time is running out. We have time. This young lady had a question here, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Oh, okay, great. I love that.
I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and my education definitely was not nearly as broad as it should have been regarding race and religion and diversity. And then coming to BU, which is an extremely diverse school compared, I was at Indiana University last year, and I transferred. And this is a lot more diverse for me, but I think something I'm just wondering is there, because right now it's clear that, oh yeah, I got you. So, is there a way to create an environment in the workplace where everyone is taught about those issues? Because it is not always taught in school. There are laws being put in place where you cannot learn it in school. So I know if you run a business, like how can you implement teaching these things to people? Because even if they haven't learned it, they might be interested, or they're oblivious to it, and they join the workforce and they need to learn about it. I just had a job and I was in training, and they talk about like employee conduct with each other, but race and diversity wasn't mentioned once. And I thought that was crazy to me. And so where do you implement that into a workplace?
I mean, that's something that has to happen on a very high level in an organization. And through my work with the Poynter Institute, we work with a number of news organizations, including Tegna, which owns 49 news stations across the United States. As part of our work with Tegna, they made it mandatory not only for their news employees, but for their marketers to go through training with Poynter that was probably a total of 6 hours of training per person that was spread out over some period of time. But a big piece of that, and a big finding from the people who went through the trainings, was that going through that helped normalize talking about race. People are so uncomfortable oftentimes that even when they hear the word race, that shuts down the conversation. So by defining, here's what the terms of diversity are, which is not that it's only about race, because that's another thing that people frequently kind of stop at some sort of binary definition of race. So we go very deep into all the different kinds of facets of diversity, all the different kinds of intersectionality, how you really need to get to know your colleagues and your sources beyond a transactional nature. So having everybody in that organization having the same baseline vocabulary has really helped them. This isn't something that I can mandate for all newsrooms in the United States, although I would certainly love to do that. But I think a big piece of it has to be that your leadership at the top has to agree this is something that is important. And this was part of Tegna's imperative, is part of this, their strive for inclusive journalism, that's what their program is called, inclusive journalism, is to have everybody understand that you have to talk about all these different aspects of diversity at all kinds of levels. While you're making news decisions, while you're out gathering stories, when you're deciding what you're gonna put on the air or what you're gonna put online. And so these are conversations that are happening at all levels all the time. And sometimes someone's gonna be uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that you can't have the conversation.
Does that help? Okay, kudos to you for being aware. That's one of the adjectives that we talked about up here for allyship, so kudos. Good on you, as they say. It is almost 3 o'clock, and I like to make sure that we stay on time here, so thank you so much to Shauna, Doris, and Moiz. I'm Professor McDuffie. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it, and we'll see you for the next panel. Thank you.